let us get started with the panel itself. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to everyone joining from all across the globe. I am Shreyoshi Padri, and I lead Global People Research and Analytics at McGraw-Hill. Today, I have the distinct honor to moderate a discussion with four of my very, very talented colleagues. The topic is an important one. It's on ethics in the use of AI within human resource contexts. So first, why don't we just go around the virtual table and give the panelists a chance to introduce themselves? Panelists, I would like each of you to tell us more about, well, start with your names, what you specialize in, and maybe some preliminary thoughts on what HR, human resources means to you. Why don't we start with Cherie?
Thank you, and thank you for having me today. My name is Cherie Edwards. I am an assistant professor at Virginia Commonwealth University School of Medicine in the Office of Assessment, Evaluation, and Scholarship. My specialty is actually in research methods. So my background is in qualitative and mixed methods methodologies. So while I don't have direct experience with HR, part of my job is to design evaluations and research studies around not only student learning curriculum, but also experiences within our faculty, clinical faculty and staff experiences and organizational culture. So for me, HR is another venue for me to kind of figure out how best to match methods with purpose.
Who wants to go next? What about Rosh? Do you want to go next?
Sure. Hi, everyone. I'm so happy to be with you. I'm Rosh Rupani, and Shreyoshi and I are colleagues at McGraw-Hill Education. I manage the learning and development function at McGraw-Hill Education. It's a global function, and it's something that I absolutely love to do. There's a lot of enterprise-wide projects that I get to be involved in to help employee development. So what I have to offer is to come to this panel with a learning and development perspective around AI and really how to learn more about it. What are the most important questions to be asking yourself about this topic and the impact of this topic to specifically HR. So I'm really happy to be here. I've spent over 15 years in learning and development. I thrive off of your energy and your questions. So feel free to interact in the chat box and throw your questions in there while we're talking. And we'll do our best to answer as many of them as we can.
Thanks, Rosh. Amit, do you want to go next?
Absolutely. Shreyoshi, first of all, thank you for having me on this panel. It's really great to be here and be a member of this very distinguished panel. We've met before, and I was amazed by everyone's background and experience in this area. I lead a company called People Analytics Success, and as the name suggests, I help companies as well as individuals achieve success in their people analytics journey. And that's done through consulting, through executive coaching, and through education. I've established people analytics teams at companies like McKesson and Apple, and I've had HR leadership roles at companies like IBM and Goldman Sachs. So I've been in HR for quite a long time. I fell into it almost by accident. I was a labor economist originally, and as a result, that made perfect sense when I wanted to move into a private sector job to get into HR. I'm based in Boston, and I'm also a board member on a couple of advisory boards for HR tech companies that use artificial intelligence in their products. Thanks so much for investing your time. I know you have probably lots of alternatives, especially with the sunny weather that we're experiencing on the East Coast. And I look forward to learning on this panel as well.
Thanks, Amit. Rachel, let's go for your introduction.
All right. Well, thank you so much for having me as well. And hi, everyone. My name is Rachel Whaley, and I'm here with LA Tech for Good. And we work to amplify and advocate for social impact technology in Los Angeles and beyond. I am really passionate about equity and ethics in data and machine learning and AI. So really excited to be having this conversation with you all today. I also have a tiny bit of background in learning and development, so super passionate about that area of HR as well, and really looking forward to our discussion.
Thanks, Rachel. So I guess we'll just start with you. You spoke about your experience working with ethics and AI at LA Tech for Good. What are some of the challenges that you have seen, or examples that come to mind where, while employing AI for human resources, it has led to bias, or it has led to undesired outcomes?
Yeah, it's a great question. And unfortunately, I think there are a lot of examples of that. I think one that some of the folks listening in might be familiar with is an algorithm used at Amazon. I think this was back in 2014, relating to how they sorted through resumes to kind of screen for hiring. And that story has gotten a lot of coverage, but one piece that I think I'd really like to zero in on is that it all kind of comes down to the data that they use. So if you're not super familiar with AI or machine learning, you can kind of think of it as pattern recognition. So it's a way to kind of look at a really large amount of data and try to identify patterns and draw conclusions. I think we all know that humans can certainly draw biased conclusions from anecdotal or even larger sets of data from the human perspective. So we shouldn't be surprised that the same thing can certainly happen in technology. So what happened in this case with Amazon is that they found that their tool was screening out women's resumes, or any resume that referenced, say, a women's college or women's sports team or anything like that. And what's interesting there is that the data that they're using to establish this pattern, it wasn't a data set of everyone in the world who's ever become a successful employee anywhere, right? Their data set was everyone that Amazon has hired historically, right? And those are two really different groups. And I think in a perfect world, if you were going to design an algorithm for this, if that's appropriate, and that's kind of another piece of the conversation, you'd want to make sure you had the right data set, right? A data set that had kind of equitable representation of all kinds of different backgrounds of people who ended up being successful. And without having that data set, it's not possible to build an algorithm that'll predict that. The algorithm predicts whatever you kind of put into it. So I think that's a really important piece to highlight, and you don't need a technical background to understand that part, to understand what data you do have and what it can kind of be extrapolated from that. So I think that's the most important point, especially if you're newer to this topic. That's the most important point to start thinking about.
No, absolutely. I think with AI, with any algorithm, like you said, they're programmed to basically, learn from existing data. And if our existing data is not appropriate, is not inclusive, then we're definitely going to perpetuate some of the stereotypes, some of the biases that are already in our system. Any other thoughts on this, panelists?
So Shreyoshi, I'll jump in here. There's a lot of technology that's already being utilized in the HR space, right? And so for us working in the HR space, to think through, okay, what is the technology? What are the parameters or the data sets that are being leveraged within that technology? And how can I impact those decisions? So let me give you an example. We leverage a mentoring platform that has an algorithm that matches employees, mentees and mentors, right? And there's a whole bunch of threshold questions that need to be answered for the algorithm. So this is where, as HR, professionals, we have to really think through, what would be appropriate thresholds, and asking that very question of who am I leaving out by asking for this data point. So AI is only as good as the data that's fed into it. It's also only as good as the analysis of the data, so the interpretation of the data. And then it's only as good as what are your objectives and what are you trying to achieve from leveraging that data, right? So in our case, we're really trying to ensure that a mentee is matched with a mentor, and that the mentee's learning objective, whatever it is they're looking to learn on, let's just say communication skills, and the mentor, if say they're an expert in communication, it makes sense, right, to then match those two individuals because the mentee is getting something valuable out of it and the mentor is able to share their expertise. So that's just a concrete example about how the landscape of HR is changing with AI and with technology. And it's the way of the future. It's already happening where it's in the now and it's here to stay. So that's just my perspective. I'll, ask for any other perspectives.
Rosh, I think you bring up a great point, which is that so much of it comes down to decision making and your values and as an organization, and also the goals of what you're trying to achieve, right? If you're thinking really critically about what you're trying to achieve and for whom, and you're making sure that you're not leaving anybody out, right? And you're making decisions that are aligned with those values. I think those are steps you can take maybe in any program, not just related to AI in HR, but specifically using those things with AI, I think are some key steps to avoid some of the challenges that we've seen in some of the other examples.
Niels in chat talks about how, some of his friends who are maybe job seeking and who are probably 50 and above believe that ATS systems, talent acquisition systems may be their foes. And I think they bring up a very important point that, we have been talking about as well, that the onus really lies on us as HR professionals, as the ones using and implementing the algorithms to make sure that the ethical considerations are really thought of. We can't really shift the onus on the data scientists or the software developers and say, hey, you designed a flawed product, which is right, they probably did. But since you are using the product and you are the ones making the decisions, you also need to be empowered as HR professionals to be making sure that the decisions that you're making are ethical and sustainable. So with that, Amit, I know you have a ton of experience leading, people analytics projects and solving for challenges in HR. So what, in your opinion, are some maybe research designs which can really help counter the adverse impact that AI solutions may bring in?
Yeah, so, as Rachel says, it's really all about the data. And it's pattern recognition is a brilliant way to put it. And in HR, we're fortunate now to have more data, right? With the big data explosion in the past, HR processes weren't really designed to generate data, but now more and more they're generating data, and we have more information at our disposal at every stage of the employee lifecycle, all the way from when they were applicants. And so wherever you need to categorize or match or optimize or select essentially pattern recognition, this is where AI comes in. And so in HR, there's plenty of opportunity for that. So many, many different use cases emerge within HR. And I will say that, while we're talking today about the ethical implications of AI and thinking about it from almost the negative standpoint, we can actually use AI to find bias as well in decisions. So for example, in performance management, in compensation, you can use various AI techniques to discover whether your process is biased or not. But there are many, many use cases all the way from talent acquisition to internal labor markets. So, matching mentors with mentees, as in Rosh's company, helping people find their best career internally, creating a match between what's open and individuals' preferences and skills. And that's one of the companies that I advise called Paddle HR, that helps people see their potential careers within a company so they don't have to leave. And I think AI is also used to, for example, infer skills. So it's such a hard thing in the learning and development world to understand what's the sum total of all of your skills and competencies in a company. You can easily pull it off LinkedIn. In fact, everyone keeps it up to date there. But what if you could just infer people's skills? And companies like IBM have been doing this for quite some time. Recently, they sort of scanned all their employees' skills. And for 80% of the employees, their AI was able to identify with 100% accuracy what their skills were. So that really helps in workforce management and workforce planning. But what the problem becomes when what's good for the company is not necessarily good for the employee, right? And that's where you begin to have these ethical questions come up. And just following up on the last conversation, I think this is an important reason why people analytics needs to be within HR, because we can actually have those sentiments about caring for the employees, their rights, and what the outcomes are. But in terms of strategies for mitigating bias, I always advise companies to try and come up with an ethics charter of some sort. So sit down with the right stakeholders and figure out, in what situations will we use AI? How will we make decisions when something, ethical or fuzzy comes up? And I think, if you don't have those mechanisms in place, many of your projects might fall short because you haven't been able to pass that smell test of, is it right? Are you using the information in the right way? I think we have to think a lot about liability. And some of the onus might be on a vendor that uses AI, but very much it's on the company, because at the end of the day, it's the company's reputation that is at stake. I also advise companies in terms of a strategy when they begin using AI is to do a pilot. Start somewhere small, get your hands dirty, figure out the ins and outs, understand what's going on. And when I was at Wayfair, we did a pilot in talent acquisition, and it was really a way to get comfortable, but also to understand how people think about AI and use AI. So it is for talent acquisition, and that actually became a case study for MIT Sloan School of Business in terms of how to think about beginning to use AI in a company. But I will say that people analytics has somewhat over-rotated onto quantitative analysis. And that's what we typically think of for artificial intelligence. But there's also natural language processing and computer vision and other things where we can finally begin to address all of the unstructured data that we have in a company, whether it's performance reviews, job descriptions, and if you really go all out through organization network analysis, some of the content of emails and calendars as well, just from an NLP standpoint. And so I think there's room for now qualitative research as well, or mixed methods research, which I know is Sherry's specialty. And so let me just, should probably stop there and let others jump into.
Yeah, no, perfect. Sherry, you are our in-house mixed methods research expert. So do you want to maybe elaborate on what mixed methods is and maybe how teams can incorporate such strategies in understanding different contexts?
And I think just building on the previous conversations, it's important to understand that as we do move into an era where technology is used in place of human researchers, right? So NLP is huge now because we have to collect a massive amount of data in a very short period of time. So mixed methods is a growing methodology. It's a growing tradition in research that is meant to merge quantitative, which is numbers-based data, with qualitative, which is more anecdotal or narrative-based data. And the purpose of using this methodology is to kind of offset the weaknesses of each of those approaches, because quantitative data you can generalize and summarize experiences, but it does not give you insights into nuances and context. where qualitative is the exact opposite. It gives you nuance and context, but it is not generalizable because it is so based in context and nuance. But when you're talking about human experiences, when you're talking about actually looking at people and their experiences in work and work environments and organizational cultures, it's important to understand the nuances of those experiences. It's important to actually get into what's happening on a day-to-day basis from one person's perspective, but also from the entire organization. And from the perspective of equity, it's even more so important not to dismiss people's experiences because they're not, they don't align with the masses. And that's usually what happens when we look at quantitative data. If it's an outlier, then that's something that we really don't include in our reports. So the purpose of mixed methods is to take those two methodologies, those two traditions, and to integrate them in a purposeful way. It's not just we have quantitative data over here and qualitative data over here. It's we can use one of these approaches as to frame what we're doing, and then the other one to kind of build in what we're doing, right? So let's say that you are doing an evaluation. And you want to look at how a department is performing. So you're doing a performance evaluation, you want to look at the department's performance. So you can look at the department's performance, but then you see that there are two people who are whose performance rating doesn't align with the rest of the department. You can go and actually collect more data. But when we're looking at these higher numbers, because it's becoming more normalized for people to collect large qual data. And Shreyoshi and I have had this conversation over and over and over again when it comes to NLP. I'm a qualitative purist, so I do believe that the researcher has to jump in there and kind of break things down. But when it comes to mixed methods, I feel more comfortable using AI approaches to collect that qualitative data because I know that quant is going to be there to help triangulate. So you might get two different answers, but you actually have a way of looking at either the same question or supplemental questions and saying, how does this add to my understanding of this experience or this phenomenon or this construct versus I have numbers and words. So my argument is more valid and I don't have to really pay attention to these experiences. So I think the crux of mixed methods is this meaningful integration between the words and the numbers to make sure that you are developing insights that can capture both context and summarize. So I'll stop there.
No, that is an excellent overview. Like you said, when you work with mixed methods, you can say you have the numbers and you have the words. I remember that there was this class that I took on mixed methods methodology with your advisor, Dr. Creamer, and one of her introductory classes, she introduced mixed methods, and she said people tend to trust numbers, but they love a good story. And that has stayed with me. That is essentially what mixed methods feels to me when I think about HR and think about decision making. Because yes, we tend to trust numbers, and yes, we can generalize, but I want to hear the stories about the outliers. Why are there outliers? Why is there a problem with inclusion? Is there something that is throwing them to the corners? And that is where definitely mixed methods can add so much value to every context, but especially within HR. So thank you for that great overview. Anyone else want to jump in?
Yeah, Sherry, you used a fantastic word, triangulation. So I know it's a technical word within mixed methods research, but triangulation just means you look at various different sources to make sure you have the context and you're not relying on one particular result to make a conclusion. And that's what you should do whenever you're using AI. You get a result, a prediction. Make sure you check it against other, even different data sources, but other outputs from whether it's qualitative or quantitative, but don't rely just on one output or one model.
Rachel, I see you've unmuted yourself. Do you want to share anything?
I did. I wasn't sure if you were moving to the next question yet.
No,
Yeah,
go
just to
ahead.
kind of build on what Amit and Cherie are talking about. I think being able to kind of insert those stories and look at other data points is excellent. And I think kind of another layer, even in addition to that, as we're thinking about ethical approaches to these things, is it actually making sure you're giving your stakeholders an opportunity to give you feedback on any prediction or decision that AI is making about them. So if it's predicting something for them and they're like, well, that's not right, that's not accurate for me, there needs to be a mechanism in place for them to kind of report that back to you to kind of collect those pieces of feedback to be able to inform the system moving forward. And that can be a great tool for kind of ensuring that you have a more sort of equitable, ethical approach to the use of AI. So I think that's a really important piece to add in.
No, thanks. Absolutely, Rachel. So before we move on to one of our final questions, there was a question in our chat, and to all the attendees, make sure you put your questions into Q&A and your comments in chat. But if you do put a question into chat, we'll be sure to bring it up in our discussion. But there was a question which said, can we have some highlights on the key ethical issues AI presents, especially in relation to recruitment decisions? So I'm wondering if anyone wants to briefly just go over maybe recruitment and talk about, I think there was another comment about how we are moving very fast with quantitative heavy paradigms and phases is how they put it within HR, and that may be a mismatch with the more traditional HR roles. So any examples that are related to recruitment that any of you want to bring up?
So Shreyashi, I don't have anything specific around recruitment, but I want to take a step back around AI, right? It's this concept that sometimes it's really hard to wrap our head around it. It's also defined in many different ways. I think when we met earlier as a panel, we talked about the AI landscape, right? So it cannot just impact recruitment, it can impact all aspects of HR. I think the question around recruitment needs to be specifically, what is the impact? I talked earlier about what is the clear objective that you're looking to achieve, right? Is it that, you notice that there's a problem that with bringing in candidates, that really matched the role requirements? What is the problem that you're looking to solve for recruitment? And what would be a successful outcome if you were to leverage AI to be able to solve that problem? And the other question I would say is, if you're within a role and within a specific function of HR, be a part of that conversation. Don't undervalue the knowledge and experience that you have. So if you are an expert in recruitment, you've been there for quite some time, influence the conversation around what technology will be used, how will it be used, what is the clear impact that we're looking for, and really be a part of that conversation, because that's where you can bring in your expertise. And, vendors will have all these options to share with you, but doesn't necessarily mean it's the best option for your organization and it's solving the need that you have, right? So be selective and really question the purpose around, why are we using this data? Will it truly help us solve this problem? Right? So I know that's more of a generic answer and it's not specific about one specific thing in recruitment, but I think that that mental model can be used in any way, in any part of HR and beyond.
And as a quant-leaning mixed methods person who likes generalizing things often, I can say that having that mental model really helps. And even though it's not specific to recruitment, it can be used to different HR contexts. So absolutely asking yourself, does this situation, does this context even warrant an AI solution, is a good place to start when you're thinking about AI, because I feel like oftentimes we see these terminologies and we see these methods and they seem so exciting because they are like black boxes, they're magical. things that are going to take away all our HR problems. And more often than not, if they seem too good to be true, it's because they are. And so really asking ourselves if we're even interested in going down that route before we want to invest heavily in AI for certain problems.
Yes, and I want to add to that. I think you had mentioned another concern around the speed of AI. That was another question that came up. And I think AI is fundamentally in most organizations leveraged to intentionally increase the speed and pace of how things get done, right? So if you have a workforce with hundreds of thousands of employees, it's going to take a very long time to manually go through data. So you're going to leverage AI to speed up the process, right? So it's speed is inherent in AI. Again, it always goes back to what are we looking to achieve? And yes, you know, we have hundreds of thousands of employees, or maybe we just have 1,000 employees, or whatever the case is. But what are we looking to achieve, and how can we do it in a way that is going to be ethical and also legal? Someone else had pointed out how important the legal implications are of leveraging AI. But most importantly, what is the impact going to be? And is that impact what you're looking to achieve?
Yes, absolutely. So I want to close the more formalized, structured part of this discussion with you, Rosh. You are our learning and development expert, and I wanted to really ask you about your recommendations for the future of people analytics, and thinking about people analytics professionals who are getting more and more deeper and more embroiled into all things AI and machine learning and natural language processing. What advice do you have for HR professionals? Just thinking ahead.
So thinking ahead, before I go into my spiel, I want to ask the audience, what have you done perhaps thus far to learn about the topic of AI? Go ahead and type your responses into the chat box. Have you read an article about it? Have you taken a course on it, watched a video on it? There's so many different ways of learning nowadays. So just curious to see what your reactions are around what sort of action have you already taken. So I'm already seeing some come through. Google search, webinars, articles, right? Information on LinkedIn, reading books, great TED Talks, awesome. I'm so happy to hear this because AI is here to stay. It's not going away. It's like, it's the analogy I use is like, once the light bulb was invented, we're not going back to the dark, right? Like, but you also want to figure out what you're going to use it for, right? And if you're going to go to sleep, the light bulb needs to be turned off, right? So what's the intention? But AI is here to stay, and it's something that we really have to actively learn about, right? And think 5 steps ahead. Think about your role in HR and your industry, the industry that you're working in, the space that you're in, right? And think through, okay, what are the implications of AI? What could potentially happen, for my role? Are there maybe parts of my role that could be automated, right? Are there parts, are there parts of my role that can't be automated? It still needs that human touch or that human conversation. Really sort of think ahead about your industry. So things in your industry, what's changing in your industry? Obviously each organization needs income to survive, right? So they're looking to make profits. So what are the things that you might imagine that your industry is going to shift? And then that has a ripple effect on HR and specific to your role and to employees in your industry. So these are the questions, as I mentioned earlier, that it's not that I have all the answers, I don't. It's more about what are the questions we need to be thinking through, and how can we continue to learn about AI and how it's going to impact us. So, so I would urge you to put time on your calendar, block your AI learning time, Maybe it's just 5 minutes a week. I mean, I've learned as much as I could about AI by reading articles, HBR articles. They're short to the point, and there are times where I don't have time to sit through an hour video or course. So if it's an article you're going to read about how AI is shifting the workforce, so stay ahead of the trend. Definitely don't ignore it because it's the way of the future. And I would say, ask yourself, how can you be a part of it? How can you influence how your organization is going to leverage it? I read this awesome article a couple of years ago, and I apologize, I can't remember the exact title of it, but I just remember the two words that stood out to me, which was the hybrid model of AI plus sign humans. So how can we coexist with AI? And I want to leave you with that question. So, block the time to learn about it. And if there are any resources that you have already checked out and you've thought, wow, this is a great resource, I encourage you to share it with your peers and throw it into the chat box if you've got the link, and you can throw it in there. But if there are resources, share it with your colleagues, your team members, the people that you work with. Maybe you'll be the person who drives the conversation around AI, within your team or within your function or your department. And that's a good thing, right? You want to be a part of that conversation. And that means that you're a valuable stakeholder in that conversation. So the three things I would say is think 5 steps ahead, ask about how is AI going to impact your industry? How is it going to impact my role? And what could I be learning? What skills do I need for the future to be able to thrive in this new AI-driven environment?
Thanks, Rosh. Spoken like a true L&D expert. Anyone else want to weigh in before we move to Q&A?
I'll just say what Rosh said. Everyone rewind the recording, listen to what she said again. Very important. I would just, Suresh's put in some readings in the chat. I would just say, if you're interested in this area of ethics and AI, John Sumser, some of his articles are listed, is a really thoughtful, prolific person to follow in this area. Now, when you do your AI course or webinar or whatever, if you can, try and do one that involves actual data, because if you can get it under the hood, and there are ways to do it. And remember, even regression analysis is a form of AI, right? So if you can get your hands dirty with data, you'll have that much more of an understanding of the implications, all the way from data gathering, because bias even comes in during data gathering, bias comes in during data manipulation, and then bias comes in the algorithm itself. So try and do that. Force yourself if you need to, because as Rosh said, this is the future. And if you can get ahead of it and be a little bit of an expert relative to everybody else, you'll be that much further ahead.
Thanks, Amit. So let's move on to the Q&A. So we have 8 questions. I don't know if we'll get to all of them, but let's try. So D asks, I'm interested in the defensibility of AI systems in terms of reliability and validity, particularly in consideration of diversity and possible disparate impacts due to culture. Any thoughts on that?
Is that in the Q&A section?
Yes, that's in the Q&A. So that's the first question that we have at 5:04 p.m.
I can speak to it a little bit. I think the use of the word defensibility, I mean, I think kind of what you're getting at is like, how do we know we're getting the results that we want or expect, or that we should be getting? How are we sure that there isn't bias kind of coming out of this technology? And I think that is a little bit of a hard question unless you go and kind of look at your data. You're kind of really clear on what data this tool is using and why, right? How does that relate to what you're hoping to get out of the system? If you're hoping that it's going to recommend someone's resume over someone else, or you're hoping that, whatever you're hoping it's going to a mentor, kind of any of the examples that have been talked about today. I think you have to be able to dig into what information are you feeding it. When you get results from it, how do your stakeholders react? Would your, if you showed it to one of the employees about whom it made a prediction, would that employee say, yep, that sounds right, or no, that doesn't quite seem right, or wow, that seems really unfair, right? Like, what would their reaction be? Have you gone and checked that? Maybe held a focus group, maybe done that research, maybe using some of the points Cherie brought up earlier. You got to do the work and kind of dig into the details to understand what's going on. So I think don't treat it as a black box. Would maybe be one recommendation. Kind of try to get under the hood and understand what's going on in there and why, and does it align with these things that I'm looking for.
Yeah, the key thing here is what's known as explainability, right? So can you actually go back and explain what the model did and how? And in many AI algorithms or approaches, you can do that. In some, you can't. So if you're using deep learning as one form of machine learning, at some point it becomes very hard to disentangle how actually the algorithm came up with the recommendation. So it's important to choose the right methodology and to be able to explain. And again, the more you can get have an understanding of how this works, close to mathematically or with the data, you'll be in a better position to make those choices.
Yes, great answer. So can we have some highlights on the key ethical issues AI presents in relation to recruitment? So this was, again, recruitment. I believe this is the same questions. So Catherine says ethical, sustainable, and legal. And I see the word legal coming up a lot. And while I appreciate it, I think it's important to think about legal considerations. I think there are so many, because AI has advanced, and sometimes legal infrastructure may not have caught up. So it's important to be ethical before you think about legal and think about defensibility. My 2 cents on it, I'd be interested to hear what others have to say about that. But really be cautious at ending at legal or ending at defensibility, because maybe even legality and defensibility aren't there yet where we need to be as HR professionals, because we are impacting human lives, actual human lives are at stake. And maybe the legal mechanisms haven't caught on to some of the things that AI is doing and how AI is impacting. So just thinking about those. Any thoughts on that?
I mean, Sriyoshi, I completely agree that I think the technology is advancing a lot faster than the public policy is in many cases. And so, while certainly, of course, you should follow all the sort of legal, guidelines that exist, I think it absolutely goes beyond that. And to Amit's point earlier about having an ethics charter to sort of guide your conversations, certainly there's things that your company does in every domain that aren't, say, required by the letter of the law, but that are going to make a better experience for your employees or your customers. And this is just another area where that absolutely applies. So if you're clear on your values, I mean, you're already doing this in most other areas anyway, right? So why not do it here?
Absolutely. One of our participants asked us, how can you leverage AI while still ensuring you keep privacy and data security? And I guess they were asking more about GDPR when thinking about those regions. But just talking about privacy and data security in mind in terms of the employees, for example, whose data we are using, how do we go about leveraging AI and AI technology and tools better while also being ethical and considerate about privacy and security?
So Shreyoshi, I could try to answer that. So I think privacy and the type of data that we collect from our employees, it varies from country and region, and there's different laws that dictate the rules around what you can collect and what you can't. I think the rule of thumb is that you go back to what is the impact that I'm looking to make and what data do I need to be able to achieve that, right? And not getting data just for the sake of getting data, right? I mean, it's our individual data points, right? And all of us on this panel too, right? So what is the relevance of the data that you're collecting? So one, being aware of what are the laws around privacy within your country, your region, your state, you know, depending on where you live. And then two, sort of a rule of thumb around it is, why are we collecting this data if we don't need it? Because it's not going to impact, it's not going to make a change, right? Or we do need this one piece of data and it's going to make an impact. And then ensuring that your user or your employee is aware that you're collecting that data from them, right? So, and this is where I think sometimes as the end user or employees, all those terms and conditions that come up, we don't take the time to read it. Sometimes you're clicking yes and you're consenting to giving your data. And that could not just be for HR, but for any application that you're using online. So, so if you are wanting to be cautious, it's tedious, but you'll have to read this details to see what is your data being leveraged for.
Absolutely. I think being transparent as an organization is key. And that also helps with building and maintaining trust between employees and HR, because oftentimes there is that distrust, especially when we're thinking about using employee data. What is it going to be used for and how it's going to be used for? So absolutely, Rosh. Great points. Anyone want to add to that?
Just a very small additional point. In some cases, employees have the right to not let their data be used. And what that does then is it, in some ways, distorts the sample even further. So, your particular employee set by itself is sort of a selective sample. And then if randomly or non-randomly people decide not to take part, then that smaller sample is even more selective. And this is all really an example of sample selectivity bias, right? Which is something that hopefully everyone is thinking about, because in HR, we refer to lots of surveys, but very few people actually go and ask, how was the data collected? What's the basis for the survey? And there's incredible bias that comes up in the responses. Simple case, when consultants do surveys, and they say 90% of companies are interested, but only 10% are doing something about it, obviously because they're asking companies who are interested in improving. So you're going to get numbers like that. So anyway, sample selectivity bias is important.
Yes, absolutely. Sorry, go ahead, Shuri.
And to that point, I think what you'll see with AI is, for me, is ironic, is that as we start using it more in addressing like empirical questions, that it is going to surpass the practices that we use in traditional research methods. Part of the issue when it comes to ethics and equity, when it comes to answering questions, collecting data, doing research, is that research methods were not developed traditionally to be equitable or even ethical. They were developed to answer questions that that people had about things they didn't understand, and sometimes those things were marginalized groups. Sometimes those things were I think the benefit of working in higher education for me is the IRB, but even with the IRB, I don't think some of the right questions are being asked. So when you look at organizations, when you look at the use of AI in these organizations, I think having these types of discussions will help to progress research methods and traditions beyond these practices that sometimes still marginalize people and participants and don't necessarily progress equity in collecting data. And the IRB, I'm sorry, is the Institutional Review Board, which monitors any type of research study, any type of data collection you do if you are a member of a university.
Sheree, I think that's a great point and about asking the right questions, making sure that you're asking the right questions. And I think this connects to another question that Lenora had asked, and I just dropped a quick link in the chat, which is a great resource that I would recommend. Say if you don't work at an organization that has an IRB and you want to start thinking about a good framework of questions to ask about your data and is it even appropriate to use it in any kind of AI. It's called Data Sheets for Data Sets. It's a study by Dr. Timnit Gebru et al. And it includes 52 questions. So it's a lot of questions. Maybe only a subset would be relevant to your particular use case. But I think that's a really good starting point for starting to understand what are those right questions that I should be asking about my data. So the links in the chat, I would highly encourage folks to check that out if you're interested in understanding those questions.
Yes, thanks, Rachel. I put the link back in for those who may have missed, but that is an excellent resource for those who are starting out. Well, we are almost 8 minutes to close. So any, final thoughts, some discussions that we may have missed, anything we haven't covered? Panelists, do you want to re-emphasize upon anything?
So Shreyoshi, I'll just say earlier, I saw a comment around the movie Terminator, and I love watching that movie. I've watched it like so many times. And I just want to say that's a great movie to use as motivation for us to be involved earlier on with AI, right? Because we know what the outcome's going to be in that movie, right? So so this is, I think it's motivation to say, you know what, I'm going to be a part of the conversation. I'm going to talk about these things with my team, with my manager, with whoever I'm working with. And it's okay to not have the answers. This is a very evolving field. It's evolving day by day. You're not going to know all the answers, and it's okay to say, what did you mean by that? What does that even mean? What word was that you used? I don't understand that word. Can you explain it to me? So it's okay to ask for, what does the jargon even mean, right? And what do you mean when you say this? Because there's so many different words that are used to describe it, AI, machine learning, right? All this different jargon. So I would say, based on that movie, involve yourself earlier on, educate yourself and continue to educate yourself on this topic. And I think if we can influence the direction that it goes in, then I'm hopeful that the outcome will be more towards being human-centered versus just being driven for revenue generation or cost efficiencies. But I think it'll be a balance then of being, achieving what the organization wants to achieve while also being human-centered. But we've got to make that happen. We got to be a part of that conversation.
Absolutely. Another movie that comes to my mind is The Minority Report. I watched it when I was writing my dissertation, which was on natural language processing. And I remember that all the decisions that I was making, and I was like, I don't want this to turn out to be something like The Minority Report someday.
I haven't seen that movie. I'm going to have to put it on my movie list.
For those of you who are thinking about getting into this AI journey at your companies in HR, I think it's great to have attended the session. Sorry, we aren't able to address all the questions, but I would urge everyone to be very intentional in starting this path or advancing even further. And you have to be, strategic about this. It's a very fragile sort of situation where one misstep later on could set you back, and you won't be able to benefit from AI in HR for a very long time until the memories fade. So just, and it helps to be more transparent. And so no one can fault you for not, for that at least, right? That we're trying to explain why we're doing this, how we're doing this, what the benefits are, what the risks are, how your data is being used. And the more you can come up with programs or situations where AI is being used to benefit the employee, you're going to get a lot more buy-in. And I think that's happening more and more as people analytics becomes more analytics for people from, initially it was analytics on people. So I think if you can change that flavor and make it something positive for employees, you'll get buy-in, traction, and see a lot of progress.
Ahmed, I think that's great. And I would maybe just extend it one step further to analytics with people, right? Include some of your employees in the process whenever possible. I think that goes back to some of the mixed methods that were talked about here today. But I think the more inclusive you can be in your process, in addition to being transparent, in addition to being explainable, in addition to being values driven, I think that's just another way to kind of reinforce everything that we have talked about today and make sure that you're on a path towards a more equitable, ethical outcome.
Shuri, any closing thoughts, remarks?
No, I think I agree with what Rachel and Amit are saying and what Rosh has been saying throughout the entire session. I think asking the right questions, understanding why you're collecting the data that you're collecting, using it in an appropriate way. These are all great ways to make sure that you are implementing AI in your causes in ethical in equitable ways.
Absolutely. Well, that brings us to the close of our session. Thank you, everyone, especially panelists, but also everyone who joined in. We had great discussion. I'm sorry we couldn't get to all the questions, but that's the nature of the beast. That is AI in HR. We won't get to all the questions. What is important is that we are asking them.